My son put our family home up for sale the day after I buried my wife. That was the moment I realized silence can be sharper than any blade.
My name is William Anderson. For 34 years, this house wasn't just wood and walls. It was Elizabeth's masterpiece. Every room, every color, every beam carried her touch. She used to say, a house isn't a home until it holds the weight of your memories. But when she passed, my son saw only dollar signs. Christopher was impatient even at her funeral. He stood by the casket with his phone in hand, whispering about schedules and parking. When the priest spoke her name, he sighed. When her favorite hymn played, he checked his watch. And when the last handful of soil hit her coffin, he turned to me and said, "Dad, let's not drag this out. People have places to be." That was the moment I realized silence can be sharper than any blade. At first, I thought grief was clouding my judgment. I told myself maybe he was hurting in his own way. But 2 weeks later, the truth started to reveal itself. "Dad, you're 67. This house is too big for you. It's time to move somewhere manageable." Manageable was the word he used, like I was an expense to be minimized. He walked through the kitchen, running his hand along the counters his mother designed herself, the same ones she saved for 2 years to afford. You could sell this place, buy a condo, and still have money left over. I tried explaining that Elizabeth had poured her soul into this house. She drew sketches for every room, Chris. She designed this place like she was building our life into the walls. He smirked. "Dad, it's just wood and drywall. Mom's gone. She wouldn't want you stuck here." He didn't understand that some walls hold more than memories. They hold promises. Only shadows melting into darkness.
By summer, his suggestions turned into pressure. He started sending me listings for senior communities, little apartments stacked like cages. He'd say things like, "You'll thank me later, Dad. You can make new friends, join activities. It'll be good for you." Good for me or convenient for him? Elizabeth once told me, during one of her hospital stays, he doesn't understand what it means to build something from nothing. He's never had to fight for what he loves. She was right. He had a degree, a BMW, and a paycheck, but no sense of value. I stayed quiet, because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. By October, his tone had changed. "Dad, this house is worth at least $600,000. If you sell now, you'll get top dollar. The market won't stay this high." He'd done his research, comparable sales, estimated taxes, closing costs, as if my life were a spreadsheet. And when I told him I wasn't ready to sell, he sighed like a frustrated parent. "Mom's dead, Dad. She's not coming back. You can't live in the past." He said it flat, emotionless, like he was announcing a business merger. That was the moment I knew Elizabeth had been right to worry about him.
One night, I climbed the stairs to her old craft room. The air still smelled faintly of her lavender candles. Everything was exactly as she left it. Organized, purposeful, peaceful. When I opened her desk drawer, I found something that would change everything. A leather folder labeled House Plans, Anderson Residence. Inside were over 100 pages of hand-drawn designs, floor plans, measurements, material lists, color swatches, even renovation budgets written in her careful handwriting. But at the very back, on the last page, dated 2 months before she died, she had written something that froze me in place. "This house is my masterpiece. Every room tells our story. If Christopher can't see that, he doesn't deserve it to inherit it." My hands shook as I read those words. Elizabeth had seen the future. She knew what he would try to do. The next morning, Christopher called again. "Dad, the gutters are sagging. The driveway's cracking. Maintenance on this place is gonna drain you." He said it like I was some helpless old man drowning in responsibility. I almost told him about the folder, about the plans, about what his mother had written. But I stopped myself, because patience is the most underestimated form of revenge. That night, I sat in the living room surrounded by Elizabeth's things, the carved oak banisters she'd chosen, the hand-sewn curtains, the framed photo from our 25th anniversary, and I realized something. Christopher thought grief had made me weak. He had no idea it had made me patient. And patience, I soon learned, can be a devastating weapon, especially when the person you're waiting for mistakes your silence for surrender. The night I found Elizabeth's portfolio, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning her words over in my mind. If Christopher can't see that, he doesn't deserve to inherit it. It wasn't anger that kept me awake. It was realization. She'd been planning something, something I didn't yet understand. The next morning, I went back to her craft room and searched every drawer, every cabinet. That's when I found it. A small envelope tucked beneath her sketchbook. Inside was a business card. David Coleman, estate planning, attorney. And on the back, in her handwriting, "Will, if anything happens to me, call David immediately. Don't let Christopher pressure you into anything. Trust the plan." The plan. Elizabeth had always been meticulous, but this felt like a secret blueprint for what she knew was coming. I stared at that card for hours before I finally picked up the phone. A calm voice answered,
David Coleman speaking. This is William Anderson. My wife, Elizabeth, passed away in March. I found your card among her things. There was a pause. Then he said something that made the hair on my neck stand up. Mr. Anderson, I've been expecting your call. Expecting me. We arranged to meet after the holidays. He told me there were documents Elizabeth wanted me to see, but only when I felt ready. I didn't tell Christopher, because for the first time in months, I didn't feel powerless anymore. Meanwhile, Christopher's concern turned into control. He started speaking like the house already belonged to him. Dad, I talked to a realtor, Janet Morrison. She thinks we could list for $700 if we stage it right. We. He said it like it was a joint venture. You had no right to contact an agent, I told him. Dad, I'm just being proactive. You've always said timing is everything. Timing. He had no idea how right he was. Because Elizabeth's timing, even in death, was perfect. By December, he'd taken it further. He brought printed listings, spreadsheets of potential buyers, even a mock-up of how modern upgrades could raise value. You can't afford this place forever, he said, crossing his arms. Mom wouldn't want you drowning in repairs. He loved to speak for her, the same woman whose memory he'd brushed aside at her funeral. I looked at him for a long time before answering. Your mother didn't build this house to be sold, Christopher. She didn't build it to rot either. That word, rot, hit harder than he knew. I realized that if Elizabeth had left a plan behind, it wasn't just legal protection. It was a test. When I met David Coleman on January 3rd, the winter air felt heavy with meaning. His office was in an old downtown building. Marble floors, brass elevators, the kind of place where people handled serious matters quietly. He greeted me with a firm handshake. Mr. Anderson, please, have a seat. Elizabeth spoke about you often. That caught me off guard. You met with her more than once? 7 times, he said, over the last 4 years. 4 years. She'd been planning this since 2019. While I was focused on her chemo appointments, she was quietly building something to protect our life. He opened a thick folder labeled Anderson Family Trust. Elizabeth established this trust after your son's divorce. She was worried about his financial habits and how he might act if left unsupervised with the family estate. He slid a document across the desk, pages stamped with legal seals and Elizabeth's signature. This trust places all shared assets, the house, accounts, investments, under your sole authority as trustee until your passing. So, Christopher gets nothing while I'm alive? Correct. And even afterward, his inheritance depends on your written approval. I sat back, speechless. For years, I'd thought we'd just been middle class, an old electrician and his wife. But David wasn't done.
He pulled out another folder and smiled gently. "Mr. Anderson, did Elizabeth ever mention her father's company?" "Only that he ran a small manufacturing business in Ohio before he died. He didn't just run it, he owned it. And when he passed, she inherited everything." He turned the folder toward me. Balance sheets, account statements, investment portfolios, all under Elizabeth's name. At the bottom, a number I could barely process. $35,247,892.33. $35 million.
I must have gone pale, because David spoke softly. "She didn't tell you, because she didn't want it to change who you were, and she especially didn't want Christopher to know." My hands trembled. For 30 years, my wife had carried that secret, investing quietly, protecting us, planning for a storm she knew was coming. David closed the folder gently. "There's more. She left you a video message." He set a tablet on the table. Elizabeth appeared on the screen, thinner, her hair cropped from treatment, but her eyes steady as ever. "Hi, sweetheart. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and Christopher is already talking about selling the house. I know you, Bill. You'll want to keep the peace, but don't. Stay silent. Let him show you who he really is. The trust isn't about punishing him. It's about revealing him." I couldn't breathe. "You once told me patience was a virtue. Now it's your weapon. When the time comes, let David guide you. And when Christopher thinks he's in control, that's when the truth will come out." The screen faded to black. David looked at me. "Do you want to confront your son now?" "No," I said quietly. "I want him to walk straight into the truth. Because Elizabeth's plan wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Poetic, patient, and absolute." From that moment, the game changed. I wasn't just a grieving husband anymore. I was the keeper of Elizabeth's final lesson, and my silence, it had only just begun to speak. After that meeting with David, I drove home in silence. The city blurred outside my window, all noise, no meaning. $35 million. My wife had carried that secret her entire life and trusted me to use it only when the moment was right. That night, I sat at our kitchen table, staring at the folder David gave me. The trust documents, the portfolio summary, and the video of Elizabeth's calm, knowing eyes. I realized something chilling. She hadn't just left me money. She'd left me instructions. The next morning, Christopher called. "Dad, I've got great news. Janet scheduled the photographer. We'll have listing photos by next week." He sounded cheerful, confident, like a man closing a business deal. I almost laughed. "Christopher, I haven't agreed to sell." "Dad, come on, you're dragging your feet. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Harder for who? I thought. But instead of arguing, I let him talk. Because the best trap doesn't need bait, just patience. Days turned into weeks. Christopher started treating the house like a project. He called contractors for estimates, spoke to the agent like a partner, even asked me to move some of Elizabeth's furniture for staging. He wanted to remove the antique dining table where we'd celebrated every Christmas, the hand-sewn curtains Elizabeth had made by lamplight, even the old reading chair by the window where she used to fall asleep with a book in her lap. "He make the rooms look bigger," he said. "They look just fine to me. We need to appeal to modern buyers." Modern buyers. He didn't see a home. He saw inventory. I could have stopped him right then. One phone call to David, one truth revealed. But Elizabeth's words echoed in my mind. Let him show you who he really is. So I watched. By mid-January, Christopher's arrogance had bloomed into full entitlement. He began referring to the house as our listing. "Dad, our agent says we should list around 700. If we get multiple offers, maybe higher." Our. He loved that word. The illusion of partnership. He even started planning my future. "I found this amazing place for you, Sunny Meadows. It's got a golf course, a dining hall, medical staff on site. You'll love it." "I don't play golf," I said quietly. "Then you'll learn. You need community." Community. He was shipping me off like a fragile package labeled retirement. That evening, David called. "How's everything progressing?" "He's listing the house next week," I said. "Good. Let him. Remember, he has no legal power to sell anything. But the more he believes he does, the clearer his intentions become." Elizabeth wanted witnesses. Witnesses? Yes, people Christopher respects. He wanted them present when the truth comes out. She thought of everything. The day of the photo shoot came. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, softening the world outside, but inside, my home was being stripped bare. Janet Morrison, the realtor, moved briskly from room to room, rearranging furniture, criticizing layouts. "These curtains are outdated," she said. "We'll take them down for better light." Christopher nodded eagerly. "Yeah, Mom's style was, classic. Buyers today want minimalism." Minimalism. He meant erasure. I stood by the stairs, silent, watching as the photographer's flash turned our life into a catalog. Every picture, every click felt like a theft. When they left, Christopher turned to me, energized. "Dad, photos go online Monday. We'll list Tuesday. Janet's confident we'll get offers by the weekend." He was glowing with excitement, that false confidence, the kind that comes from ignorance, was almost painful to watch. "You're doing all this without my permission," I said. "Dad, you need to stop being so emotional." Emotional. That word again, as if love were a flaw. He had no idea that the same emotion he dismissed would soon strip him bare in front of everyone who he respected. A few nights later, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt different, lighter somehow, like it knew justice was coming. Elizabeth's portrait hung over the fireplace, her smile steady, proud. I whispered to her photo, "I'm following your plan, sweetheart. He doesn't know what's coming." Because I finally understood what she'd built, a lesson disguised as a trap, and a trap disguised as love. When the listing went live, it was Valentine's Day. Elizabeth would have appreciated the irony. Her life's masterpiece turned into an open house for strangers. Christopher called, barely able to contain himself. "Dad, it's already getting views online. Janet says we'll have 3 showings tomorrow." 3 families, walking through my wife's memories like they were options on a menu. I looked around our living room, at the sunlight spilling across the floorboards Elizabeth had chosen, and thought, let them come. Let them all come. Because in a few short weeks, the house wouldn't be the only thing on display. They thought the sale would be simple, a clean deal, quick money, fresh start. But Elizabeth had planned for every detail, including the day everything would collapse, and who would be watching when it did. The day the first buyers came, I stood at the upstairs window watching strangers walk through my wife's world. The realtor called it a showing. To me, it felt like trespassing. Janet Morrison led a young couple through the front garden. The husband wore a designer coat. The wife held a toddler on her hip. "The mature landscaping really adds value," Janet said, waving toward the flower beds Elizabeth had tended for 15 years. Mature landscaping. That's what they called her devotion now. Christopher arrived halfway through, brimming with energy. "Yeah, my parents bought this place back in '87, he said proudly. "Good bones, but the kitchen definitely needs updating." Updating. That was his favorite word, as if his mother's touch had expired. He walked the couple through the dining room. "You could take down this wall," he suggested, pointing at the one Elizabeth had chosen specifically to keep her kitchen cozy. "Open concept is in right now." The husband nodded, interested. The wife smiled politely. I stood upstairs, frozen between fury and pity. When they left, Christopher called out, "Dad, they love the place. Janet thinks we'll get an offer soon." I nodded. "I'm sure you will." He didn't hear the meaning behind my words. 2 more showings followed. A retired couple, kind faces, gentle voices, whispered about downsizing potential. Then came an investor, the kind who smells history and sees demolition. He walked from room to room with a tape measure and a frown. "You'd need to gut this kitchen," he said flatly. These built-in shelves are a waste of space. Elizabeth's shelves, the same ones she'd hand-painted over 3 weekends. Christopher nodded along. Yeah, Mom had specific tastes. We'd probably modernize everything. He still believed he had ownership. That night I stood in the darkened living room. The walls echoed with phantom conversations, laughter, arguments, music. Elizabeth's world still pulsed here, and tomorrow strangers would try to buy it. I whispered to the air, "Almost time, sweetheart, almost time." The next morning my phone rang. "Dad, we got an offer! $650,000, cash, 30-day close." Christopher's excitement spilled through the line like champagne. "The buyers are the couple from Wednesday. They're pre-approved for renovations." "Renovations?" I repeated. "Yeah, open concept, new kitchen, bigger master suite. Janet says they've got great vision." Great vision for erasing everything Elizabeth built. "It's a solid deal, Dad. We should accept right away." "If that's what you think is best, son." "Finally," he said, relief in his voice. "You're being reasonable." Reasonable. Elizabeth used to say that word always hides an agenda. On Saturday, Christopher arrived with contracts and a bottle of champagne. "Dad, this is it. Janet rushed the paperwork so we can sign today." He poured 2 glasses and lifted his like a victory toast. "To Mom," he said, smiling. "She'd be happy we're being practical." Practical. He'd reduced her life to a financial decision and called it love. I clinked his glass, but didn't drink. "You're sure about this, Christopher?" "Completely. We'll get the house sold, move you into Sunny Meadows, and you'll have money left to live comfortably. You've thought of everything." "Of course, someone has to." That was the moment I knew. The lesson was ready. Monday morning, David called. "How's the sale progressing?" I said, "We're closing in 2 weeks." Perfect. Elizabeth scheduled the closing date herself, 1 year to the day after her death. I froze. She planned the date? She wanted her absence to be present when the truth arrived. I let that sink in. My wife had orchestrated her son's reckoning down to the calendar. She also arranged for witnesses, the buyers, their attorney, the realtor, all people Christopher will want to impress. She wanted him to face truth in front of them. A public reckoning built with love and precision. 2 days later, Christopher called again. "Dad, good news. Closing's confirmed for March 15th, 10 a.m. I'll pick you up at 9:30. March 15th. Exactly 1 year since we buried Elizabeth. "Dad, this is exciting," he continued. "By noon, you'll have $650,000 in the bank." "Is that so?" "Absolutely. Tom, my financial guy, will meet us next week to set up your new accounts." "You've really handled everything," I said quietly. "Someone had to," he repeated. He had no idea those would be the last words he'd say as a man in control. The night before closing, I walked through the house one last time, or so Christopher thought. I touched the banister Elizabeth had polished every Christmas Eve. I ran my hand along the kitchen counter where she'd rolled out pie dough. I stopped in her craft room, opened the drawer, and looked again at her handwriting. If Christopher can't see the value, he doesn't deserve the reward. I smiled. He'll see it soon, Liz, just not the way he expects. The morning of March 15th arrived clear and cold, exactly 1 year since Elizabeth's funeral. Christopher thought it would be a sale. Elizabeth knew it would be a lesson. March 15th, exactly 1 year since Elizabeth's funeral. The sky was the same pale gray it had been that day. Cold, quiet, and mercilessly clear. Christopher arrived at 9:30 sharp, bouncing with excitement like a man on the edge of victory. "Dad, this is it! By noon, you'll have the money wired and a fresh start ahead." A fresh start. That's what he called selling his mother's life's work for cash. As we drove downtown, he talked non-stop about condo options, interest rates, and how smart this move was. I just nodded and stared out the window, because he didn't know what kind of move we were really making. The title company was exactly what you'd expect. Glass lobby, mahogany tables, the smell of expensive coffee and paperwork. The buyers, the Pattersons, were already there. Nice people. Polite smiles, folders in hand, no idea they were about to witness a moral earthquake. Janet Morrison, the realtor, stood beside them, cheerful and oblivious. The title officer, Patricia Brooks, spread out the contracts. This should be straightforward. Cash deal, clean title, no contingencies. Christopher signed the first few papers with a flourish, leaning back like he'd just sealed a deal on Wall Street. I waited. Then Patricia looked at me. "Mr. Anderson, we just need your signature on the deed transfer." I picked up the pen and set it back down. "Actually, there's something I need to clarify first." The room went still. Christopher frowned. "Dad, what are you doing? We've been through all this." "I just need to make a phone call." I took out my cell and dialed David Coleman. "David, it's Bill Anderson. We're at the closing." "Excellent. I'll be right there." I hung up. Every face around the table was waiting for an explanation. "My attorney is on his way," I said. Christopher blinked. "Attorney? You don't have an attorney." "I do now." Patricia looked uneasy. "Mr. Anderson, is there a problem with the title?" "We'll know soon enough." 15 minutes later, David Coleman walked in, polished, professional, and carrying a leather briefcase that seemed to change the air in the room. "Good morning," he said evenly. "I'm David Coleman, attorney for the Anderson Family Trust." Christopher's expression shattered. What trust? David opened his briefcase and laid a thick document on the table. The Anderson Family Trust, established in 2019 by Elizabeth Anderson. He turned toward Christopher. Your mother's concern, Mr. Anderson, was what might happen to her home after she passed away. What is this? Some kind of joke? Christopher snapped. David didn't flinch. This trust holds all marital assets, including this house, the accounts, and the investment portfolio. Your father is the sole trustee and beneficiary. Christopher's chair screeched as he stood up. That's impossible. We don't have a portfolio. David calmly slid another folder forward. We do, or rather Elizabeth did. $35 million in diversified assets, grown quietly for nearly 3 decades. The room fell silent. You could hear the air leave Christopher's lungs. Patricia Brooks, the title officer, blinked twice. Janet Morrison's face drained of color. The Pattersons looked at each other, stunned. David continued, voice steady as a judge. This entire transaction is void. Christopher Anderson has no legal authority to sell trust property. The silence that followed was pure electricity. Finally, Christopher managed to speak. Dad, you can still sign. You're the trustee. You can do whatever you want. Right, I said quietly. I can. For a second, hope flashed across his face. Then I added, but I won't. David opened another document, Elizabeth's handwritten note, notarized and sealed. Your mother made her wishes clear, David said. If you couldn't honor her legacy, you would forfeit any claim to her inheritance. Christopher's voice cracked. What does that mean? It means, I said, you've been tested and you failed. The Pattersons looked horrified. Sarah whispered, We gave notice at our apartment. Michael muttered, We spent $2,000 on renovation plans. Patricia, the title agent, cleared her throat. We'll bill for our time. Janet Morrison quietly packed her folder, avoiding eye contact with anyone. And just like that, the room emptied. One couple, one realtor, one title officer, all leaving behind the wreckage of Christopher's arrogance. Only David and I remained with him. Christopher sank into his chair, pale and shaking. Dad, I can fix this. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. I was trying to help. You were trying to control. I thought you needed guidance. You thought I needed managing. Tears welled in his eyes. Please, I can change. Can you bring your mother back to thank her for the respect you didn't show while she was alive? He looked down. No. Can you undo rushing through her funeral so you could talk about real estate? He shook his head. Can you apologize to her for calling her designs outdated? His voice broke. I wish I could. Then learn, son, because your mother's love was patient, but not blind. David closed his briefcase. The trust will remain under your father's sole control. Any inheritance depends on whether you can prove over time that you understand what your mother valued. I stood up, gathering my coat. Elizabeth knew exactly who you were, Christopher. The question now is who you choose to become. I left him sitting there, surrounded by papers he'd never read and wealth he'd never touch, the perfect monument to a lesson he'd refused to learn. As the elevator doors closed behind me, I felt no anger, only peace, because my silence had done what shouting never could. But Elizabeth's plan didn't end there. She'd left something else, a final test for redemption. And what happened next proved that even after death, she was still teaching both of us. The drive home that day was quiet. No music, no radio. Just the hum of the road and the faint echo of Elizabeth's voice in my memory. Patience isn't about waiting, Bill. It's about watching. And I had watched my son dismantle his mother's memory one careless choice at a time. Watched him humiliate himself in front of strangers. Watched justice land without me lifting a finger. Now the house, our house, felt different. Not as a trophy of victory, but as a sanctuary of peace finally restored. Christopher called 6 times that afternoon. I didn't answer any of them. When David called, his tone was gentle. "How are you feeling, Mr. Anderson?" Like Elizabeth knew exactly what she was doing. "She did," he said. "And there's one more thing she wanted you to know." I laughed softly. "Another secret?" he said. "A message for Christopher." She left him video instructions, ways to earn back her trust if he chooses to change. Should I give them to him? Not yet. Let him sit with what happened. Let him feel the weight of it first. Elizabeth had planned for justice and for mercy. That evening, Christopher finally showed up at the door. He sat in his car for nearly 10 minutes before coming inside. When I opened the door, his eyes were red and swollen. "Dad, can we talk?" "Of course." He walked into the living room, the same room he'd once called dated. Now he looked at it like he was seeing it for the first time. He sat in Elizabeth's reading chair, the one he'd wanted moved to storage. "I messed up," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "you did. I thought I was helping. You thought you were managing." He nodded slowly. His gaze drifted to Elizabeth's china cabinet. "Mom loved rearranging those dishes for hours. I used to think it was silly." "It made her happy," I said. "Yeah, I see that now." It was the first real thing he'd said in a long time. "Dad, the 35 million, is that real?" "It is." "Why didn't she tell us?" "Because she didn't want the money to change who we were." He fell silent for a while. "I get it now. I really do. She was protecting us from ourselves." "That's right." Then he asked the question that mattered. "What do I have to do to fix this?" "I don't want you talking about fixing," I said, "and start learning." "Learning what?" "That some things are worth more than their price tag, that respect is part of love, that grief isn't something to manage, it's something to honor." He nodded, but I could see he didn't fully understand yet. Before he left, I said one more thing. "Christopher, the house stays exactly as your mother left it, until you prove you understand why that matters." He swallowed hard. "I will." I didn't answer, because time would tell. The following week, the consequences started arriving like overdue bills. The realtor demanded compensation for wasted time. The buyer's attorney sent a letter, $12,000 in expenses, architectural plans, moving fees, storage costs. Then Christopher's BMW got repossessed right in his office parking lot. His co-workers whispered. His friends disappeared. The world doesn't offer sympathy for a man who loses millions he never had. He moved back to his small apartment. His ex-wife increased child support claims. His credit cards maxed out. And through all of it, I stayed silent. Because sometimes the only way to teach a man the weight of his actions is to let the consequences speak louder than advice ever could. A few weeks later, my phone rang. "Grandpa, it's Emma." My granddaughter, 16, sharp, kind, more like her grandmother than she'd ever realize. "Dad told me about the inheritance, but I wanted to hear it from you." "What did he tell you?" "That Grandma left us millions, but you're keeping it from him." I took a deep breath. "Emma, your grandmother left instructions, not money. Your father didn't follow them." "What kind of instructions?" "To respect what people build, even when they're gone." There was silence on the other end. Then she said softly, "Dad tried to convince you to share it, but I told him Grandma was the smartest person I knew, and if she didn't trust him with it, there's probably a reason." I smiled. Elizabeth would have been proud. That weekend, Emma came to visit. She walked through every room of the house, listening to stories about her grandmother. The kitchen renovation that took 6 months. The garden Elizabeth planted from scratch. The craft room filled with designs she'd never built. "Dad wanted to tear down walls in here," Emma said quietly. "He didn't understand what they were for. Grandma did. She said every room should have a story." "She was right," I said. Then Emma found the leather portfolio, the one labeled House Plans. She flipped through the pages in awe. "Grandpa, Grandma could have been an architect," I said softly. She was. She just built love instead of houses. That night, Christopher called. "Dad, Emma told me about her visit. She enjoyed seeing her grandmother's work. I never knew Mom designed all that. I thought the renovations were just projects. They were her art." Silence. Then he said, "Emma thinks I don't understand what Mom's house means." "Do you?" I asked. "Not yet, but I want to." That was progress. A small crack in his arrogance, and through it, light began to leak in. For the first time, Christopher wasn't chasing money. He was chasing meaning. But Elizabeth's lesson wasn't finished yet, because real redemption isn't spoken, it's lived. Spring came early that year. The cherry tree in the front yard, the one Elizabeth planted the year Christopher was born, bloomed brighter than it had in a decade. Maybe it was the rain. Or maybe, I thought, it was her way of saying, "Keep watching." Christopher started coming around again. Not every day, just enough to show he was trying. He didn't bring realtors or contracts anymore. He brought groceries. "I thought you might need milk," he'd say, or bread, or coffee. It was awkward at first, like a man learning how to walk again. But I didn't correct him. I just let him help. Because sometimes rebuilding doesn't start with apologies, it starts with small, quiet gestures. One Saturday morning, he showed up with gardening gloves. I figured I'd fix the rose bed. Mom always hated weeds. He kneeled in the dirt for hours, pulling roots, trimming stems. His hands blistered, his shirt stained with sweat and soil. For the first time in years, he wasn't talking about money. He was working. At sunset, he stood up and looked at the roses, trimmed, neat, alive. "She'd like this," he said softly. She would. It was the first time he'd said something that felt like respect. Weeks turned into months. He started spending time with Emma again. They cooked together, painted the fence, rebuilt the birdhouse Elizabeth had designed. One evening, I heard laughter in the backyard, real, unforced laughter. Christopher was showing Emma how to fix the garden light wiring, explaining each tool. I stood by the window, watching him move carefully, patiently. It reminded me of myself at his age, before ambition turned to ego. When he caught me watching him, he smiled and waved. That small gesture, just a wave, felt like an entire chapter turning. A few days later, David Coleman called. "Bill, how's Christopher doing?" "He's learning, slowly, but for real." "Good, because there's one final envelope from Elizabeth that's meant for him once you feel he's ready." "What's in it?" "Her forgiveness, in writing." I stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, "Not yet," I said. "Let him earn it, not expect it." David chuckled. Elizabeth would agree. By midsummer, Christopher started bringing life back into the house. He replaced light bulbs, fixed leaky pipes, sanded the porch railing, and every so often he'd stop mid-task and just look around. "I used to think this house was too small," he said once. "It wasn't the house that was small," I replied. "I know," he said quietly. There was no defense, no argument, just acknowledgement, and that's when I knew something inside him had truly changed. In August, I walked him into Elizabeth's craft room. The smell of paint and cedar still lingered, faint but familiar. "Your mother left something for you," I said. He froze. "Another trust?" "No, a chance." I handed him a small key and pointed to the drawer, the same one where I'd first found the attorney's card. Inside was a sealed envelope with his name on it, written in her delicate handwriting. He stared at it for nearly a minute before opening it. "My dear Christopher, if you're reading this, it means you've finally stopped running from the man you were supposed to be. Money was never the inheritance I wanted to give you. Character was. If you've learned to build rather than take, to listen rather than control, then your true inheritance has already begun. The rest is waiting when your father decides you're ready. Love, always, Mom." Tears ran down his face. He folded the letter carefully, as if it were gold. "She forgave me," he whispered. "She never stopped loving you," I said. "She was just waiting for you to remember who you are." From that day forward, Christopher came by every Sunday. We fixed, painted, and restored what time had taken. By autumn, the house looked alive again, not polished, not staged, just lived in. Elizabeth's plan had worked better than either of us imagined, not because it punished him, but because it humbled him. And humility, I realized, is the most valuable inheritance a person can ever receive. Elizabeth had built more than a trust. She'd built a map, one that led her son from greed to grace. But her final gift wasn't money at all. It was the way her story would keep shaping our family long after she was gone. Autumn came early the next year. The air carried that soft chill Elizabeth used to love, the kind that made her light candles and bake pies just to make the house smell like home. Christopher and I sat on the porch that afternoon, watching Emma rake leaves under the cherry tree, the same tree Elizabeth had planted 35 years ago. "You know," he said, "I used to hate this season. Too cold, too quiet." "And now?" I asked. "Now I think it's the only time the world tells the truth. Things die back, but only so they can grow again." He paused, staring at the fading light through the branches. "Mom would have liked that, wouldn't she?" She would have said it better," I replied. We both laughed, softly, easily, like we hadn't in years. A few days later, David Coleman stopped by the house one final time. He looked around, smiled, and said, "Elizabeth would be proud. She always believed in second chances." Then he handed me a sealed envelope. This was her final instruction, to be given when you felt peace had returned to the family. The handwriting on the front was familiar, for Bill and Christopher. We opened it together. Inside was a short note and a small brass key. "My loves, if you found this, it means the storm has passed. The key opens the cedar chest in the attic, my last project. Inside, you'll find what's left of my inheritance. Use it not to change your life, but to share mine. Elizabeth." We climbed to the attic, dust rising with each step. The cedar chest sat beneath the skylight, faintly blowing in the afternoon sun. When we opened it, there were no stacks of money, no jewels, no deeds, just a collection of journals, photographs, and sketches. Her life, preserved in pages. Blueprints for furniture she'd designed but never built. Letters she wrote to Emma every birthday until age 18. And a single envelope labeled Legacy Fund. Inside was a check, not for millions, but for $150,000, made out to the Elizabeth Anderson Scholarship for Women in Design. "She created a scholarship?" Christopher whispered. "For girls who wanted to build," I said. He smiled through his tears. "She was still planning, even at the end." "She never stopped," I said. "She just handed the tools to us." Months later, we attended the first scholarship ceremony. Emma gave the opening speech, her voice steady and proud. "My grandmother taught me that design isn't about making things pretty, it's about making things meaningful. She created spaces filled with love, and somehow she's still building them today, through us." The audience applauded. Christopher wiped his eyes and whispered, "She'd be so proud of her." I said, "She'd be proud of both of you." For the first time in years, he didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes glistening as if he finally understood what all of this had been about. When we came home that night, the porch light flickered on automatically, one of Elizabeth's old motion sensor installations. The same one Christopher had once called outdated. Now he smiled at it. "Still works," I said. "Of course it does. She built it." We stood there for a long moment, father and son, under that soft yellow glow, and for the first time the silence between us felt whole. The next morning I sat at the kitchen table, writing in one of Elizabeth's empty journals. I titled the first page, "What She Left Behind." I wrote about the house, the trust, the lessons, about how patience can heal and silence can teach. When I finished, I placed the journal in the cedar chest beside her old ones, and before I closed the lid, I whispered, "You did it, Liz. You built something that'll never fade." Elizabeth's $35 million never changed our lives the way people expected. It didn't buy mansions or luxury. It rebuilt hearts. Her real wealth wasn't in numbers, it was in design, forgiveness, and the quiet strength she left behind. Christopher now runs the Scholarship Foundation full-time. Emma plans to study architecture, inspired by the grandmother she barely knew, yet she feels she's known forever. And as for me, I live in the same house, surrounded by everything Elizabeth created. Every wall, every nail, every ray of light through her curtains reminds me that love, real love, doesn't end. It simply changes form. And if you're patient enough, it finds a way to live on. She left behind more than money. She left a blueprint for grace, forgiveness, and the kind of love that outlives us all.